Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome once again to Shaftesbury Society, coming to you live from Midtown Raleigh, North Carolina. We have got a really fascinating discussion scheduled for you today. So glad that so many of you are along for this. Well, of course, the leftist notion that our country's founding dates to 1619, not 1776, has now proven quite popular in media, in culture, and in education. And now the recent hiring of New York Times reporter Nikole Hannah-Jones by UNC-Chapel Hill's journalism school has now thrust our state right into the national spotlight once again. This time, it's over the discussion of who we are as Americans, what our country represents, the principles on which our country was founded, and of course, the role of the faculty and boards of trustees when it comes to the issue of hiring people and tenure. So we've got a great panel lined up for you today and hope to be able to clear up some misconceptions for you and to also lend some perspective to this very important debate going on in our country. Joining me today is the CEO of the John Locke Foundation. She has been with us several times before, and I know that many of you have had the opportunity to meet with her across North Carolina. Amy Cook is with us today. Amy, glad you're here. Jenna Robinson is the president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, and they are following higher education issues in North Carolina. They are right in the center of this whole discussion and trying to clear up a false narrative about the hiring of Nikole Hannah-Jones. Also joining us today is Matthew Spalding, Vice President for Washington Operations at Hillsdale College. He served as the executive director of President Trump's advisory, the 1776 Commission, so he's going to have an update for us on that commission as well. And also our panelist today is Peter Wood. He is president of the National Association of Scholars, an organization that is following this issue very closely. He's also written some very compelling pieces about the issue of Nikole Hannah-Jones, her hiring, and 1619. Panelists, thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. Jenna, I'd like to start with you because there is a narrative, and it is a false narrative, that has been created in national news stories saying that Nikole Hannah-Jones actually was denied tenure. Tell us what really happened.
Thanks, Donna. So what the first we or anyone found out about this was April 27th, when the Huston School of Journalism put out a press release saying that Nikole Hannah-Jones has been hired as the night chair. And that press release did not specify whether she had tenure. It just that she was going to be the night chair, and they were very excited about it. At that point, the Martin Center and other conservative entities wrote that this was a bad decision made by UNC-Chapel Hill and the Huston School. An organization here in North Carolina later found out that the position was untenured and incorrectly assumed that it was because of conservative criticism. And so that article, it went viral, and national media picked up on it and said that she had tenure and it was revoked and this is terrible. But what really happened is that when the Huston School submitted the information about Nikole Hannah-Jones, hiring Nikole Hannah-Jones to the Board of Trustees way back in January, the committee that looks at tenure asked the journalism school some questions about Nikole Hannah-Jones' experience. Presumably, we don't have that information because it is protected personnel information, but they pushed back and they said, hey, we want some more information before we make this decision. And instead of kind of going through that, the journalism school offered her a 5-year contract with the possibility of future tenure. She accepted that. And so by the time the Huston School announced that Nikole Hannah-Jones would be joining their faculty, everyone at the school was on the same page that she was going to be offered a 5-year contract as a professor of practice, and that at some point in the future she would be able to be up for tenure review. But there has been a lot of misconception.
And that misconception really has continued, even though, Jenna, I know you have written about this and about how this actually occurred. Peter, I know that you've written an extensive piece about this as well. Do you feel like the narrative of tenure denied is still hanging on, even though we know that's not really what happened?
I think it is in the media because I mean, it's so sensational. Tenure was revoked. I mean, that sounds, uh, it is a very sensational story. And those articles in major media outlets were never corrected. And so if you Google Nikole Hannah-Jones tenure and you get to the Daily Mail or Fox News, you're still getting the incorrect stories. They didn't print corrections. And so I think that it is still hanging out there in the national media, but everyone at UNC, the faculty council, kind of local people, the News and Observer, all have the story right at this time.
Peter, I know that you did extensive research on this and wrote a very interesting piece on the whole question. So what is wrong with being offered a 5-year contract and accepting that? I mean, that sounds like a pretty good deal to me. In other words, why such a kerfuffle here over this story?
Well, of course, a 5-year contract, especially for someone who is not really even qualified for a 5-year contract, is a pretty sweet deal, especially, and it comes with a promise of a tenure review down the road if it's warranted. So there's nothing really wrong with that, but the left in academia has decided that this is a hill they're going to fight and die on. Now, it's not just what's out in the mainstream press. If you go into the world of blogs and the statements that are coming from faculty members around the country, they are really exercised by this. There's just tens of thousands of American academics who believe wrongly that she was denied tenure, and actually they don't care that that's not the true story. What they really want to do is escalate this into a fight that puts such enormous pressure on the UNC Board of Trustees that they will grant her tenure right now just so that it goes away. Now, to me, I have no inside knowledge of what goes on with that board. It would be interesting to see how susceptible to pressure they are, since the false story is that they caved into pressure to begin with. There was no pressure to begin with, but now there's enormous pressure, and this will be a test case of whether that board has the gumption to stand up against it.
Donna, can I jump in here real quick? And I say this as the publisher of Carolina Journal, and I tell people, so I have an undergraduate degree in journalism and a master's degree in history, American history, which just means I care about the history of journalism. To Jenna's point, the false narrative that surrounds this, number one, and then to Peter's point, and then we'll hear later from Matthew on this, the false narrative sort of that she has created about American history and our founding. And now we're talking about this person having a 5-year, well, she has a 5-year contract to teach journalism, and yet she hasn't been helpful in trying to set an honest narrative. And then also she has questionable academic work when you look at her 1619 project. All of this is troubling. And to me, when I look at it, when I look at what the state of journalism and the state of sort of academia, that they're more concerned about a false narrative. They're just in a frenzy over a false narrative. And nobody is curious, or I shouldn't say nobody, because this group obviously is, but there are very few people who seem curious enough to want to get to the actual truth of this. To Jenna's point, yes, some of the local news outlets have reported the correct narrative now, but there are a whole bunch of people in academia who, and in journalism too, for that matter, that aren't curious enough or want to get to the actual truth of this whole narrative that surrounds Nikole Hannah-Jones. And I find that incredibly troubling. That is a fatal flaw when people whose job it is to do research, whether it's investigative journalism or in higher education, when that's actually their job and they're not willing to do it, we have a serious problem.
Interesting. Please go ahead.
I was just going to make a point. I'll say that a general point here. tenure is a really old idea. My guess, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but this goes back to the kind of medieval, the development of the university, the whole idea of it, that an academic would have this tenure, this post at a college. Point being, it's the most important thing a college can offer, and it's something that colleges and universities, and I speak of the dean here who hires faculty, take immensely serious, and it's extremely hard to get. I mean, we put our professors through the paces. They have to have professional publications. They have to be a good teacher. They have to have good reviews. They have to have had advanced the work of their dissertation into serious academic studies. So it's an extremely serious thing. So what struck me is about this, and I appreciate especially Jen and Amy and Peter who've looked at this particular case in more depth than I have. I have watched it from afar. What strikes me is how absurd it is, just on its face, to assume that someone comes in and immediately receives tenure and essentially the full boat. That's just not how it works. That's a misunderstanding of the nature of the university, which in my second point, and here I want to, Peter's got this exactly right, as he does often on these things. We should see this for what it is. This signals that this is not an academic discussion at all. Academics has very little to do with it, actually. This is politics, and this is an attempt, as many of these things are. This is the most kind of, I think, a very public version of this. We've seen it before, to politicize something of great importance to the standing of colleges and universities. And it undermines this. That is, the implication here is that a person should receive tenure, the greatest academic honorific in its way that a university can offer its professors. They're to receive that honorific for political reasons, for what they've done to advance an ideology. And I think this is a case that just clearly signals that. I don't know her qualifications beyond the 1619 report. If that's the qualifications that I would actually let the extremely notable established historians who have criticized it have the last word. But beyond that, I don't know whether she's qualified or not. But I mean, to imply that anyone, whether it's her or anybody else, or someone on the right, for that matter, who's conservative, should receive tenure because of ideological fights they're having based on the moment in time in which they're debating, that strikes me as not only absurd, but deeply insulting to the whole academic project, which we, broadly speaking here, have for hundreds and thousands of years tried to develop in terms of spreading education and enlightenment. I'm just befuddled by the whole thing.
It is interesting, Jenna, that the Board of Trustees at Chapel Hill evidently has questions, and they want to look into those things. But the implication, again, by the narrative and some of the commentary that we're seeing nationally about this, is that the mere fact that they have questions, which, as I understand it, is a Board of Trustees' job, they're a governing board, but the fact that they have...
It's not just their job, it is their fiduciary interest as board members. It's not just a job, they must do that. It is their duty to uphold the very meaning of the university.
And that's really important. Thank you for clarifying that, Matthew, because the implication, at least to my ear, by some of these stories, is that somehow it is a problem, that they are deficient in some way because they have questions.
I think what's going on here is, obviously there's politics in it, but the other thing that's going on is that the faculty are outraged that their opinion is not being taken as the last word. It has been accepted precedent for many years that the trustee review of tenure is a rubber stamp, that they take the recommendation of the faculty and the dean and do whatever the faculty and dean have recommended. I recently sat through a meeting of the Faculty Executive Council at UNC, And most of the talk was about the process and the fact that the process is owned by the faculty. That is their expectation, and they take it as a grand insult that trustees who have no academic training and very little respect from the faculty would stick their noses into this academic issue. And that is the attitude of faculty members, not only at UNC, but in many places, that that these appointed non-academics should just, cut checks and shut up.
Please go
what
ahead.
We're talking about is usually called shared governance, and by shared governance, the faculty members mean we rule. We don't want anybody else messing around in this. The sharing is the boards raise money and write checks, and the faculty members get the last say. Well, that goes against the legal foundations of these institutions. The board of trustees really does have this fiduciary responsibility, and they occasionally exercise it. The Nikole Hannah-Jones affair is not the first time that this has happened. The Steve Salita affair in Illinois a few years ago was another example of this. Once in a while, these sleepy boards of trustees wake up and say, we really should take a look at something. And when that happens, there's often this reflexive outrage. I would say there are a couple things here to keep in mind, that any faculty appointment, not just a tenured one, requires an individual to have a certain level of accomplishment and certain commitments to what the university is all about. The pursuit of truth lies very near the top of that. Now, the problem with Nikole Hannah-Jones is that she has confabulated a false narrative of American history. That's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of every knowledgeable historian who deals with the American founding. It's not just one or two mistakes, it's a narrative that is rife with mistakes from beginning to end. Now, it's one thing to make mistakes, we all make them, but then we also have a responsibility to acknowledge those mistakes when they're pointed out. In the case of Nikole Hannah-Jones, some of her mistakes were pointed out by fact checkers before she went to press with the article. She refused to make changes then. Then they were pointed out again and again by some 24 major American historians. The New York Times and Nikole Hannah-Jones just brushed them aside. To this day, there are major parts of the 1619 Project which are flatly false. Now, there is, even if you're not a historian, but a journalist, a responsibility to tell the truth. And what we have in the record of Nikole Hannah-Jones, at least for the 1619 Project, is someone who operates heedless of the facts, has a strong opinion, a thesis that she wants to advance regardless of what the facts are, and an unwillingness to confront her critics in a reasonable way. This is not a definition of scholarship. Well, maybe in a school of journalism, if the Hussman School wants to be considered in this light, telling truth, pursuing facts, listening to critics, responding to them in a reasonable way, don't count for anything. They might want to change their name. They're no longer a school of journalism at that point. They're a school of opinionating, and that's what we get. Now, Nikole Hannah-Jones brings several other things besides the 1619 Project to the table. She won the MacArthur Award a few years ago. She won the Pulitzer Prize last year. She has a chest full of other lesser awards in the field of journalism. And she was known for writing several fairly lengthy articles in the New York Times and some other places. Whether any of that has been subjected to scrutiny, I don't know. If it's as dubious quality as the 1619 Project, one has to question the wisdom of those other awards as well. But does someone get offered an academic position on the basis of having a collection of ribbons and awards and scholarships? The answer is no. You have to actually have proven scholarship, and she has none. So I fault the trustees of the University of North Carolina for allowing this appointment to go forward at all. I understand the reasons for that. You know, great publicity, presumably, have one of the most popular ideologues in the country on your faculty, so you can wave a flag and say, look who we've got here. Nikole Hannah-Jones is everywhere. She gave a speech at Bowdoin College recently. We are seeing someone who is a genuine academic celebrity, and if celebrity endorsement is all a university wants to do, there's lots of other celebrities that they can select as well. But it's a terrible idea, and it really tarnishes the reputation of the University of North Carolina that they allowed this to go ahead at all. Thank God they didn't give her tenure as well.
Hey, Donna, on that point, this really concerns me. And what Peter said, you hit the nail on the head. Like facts, at least they should matter. They should, especially in journalism. I mean, it's not even as if we're talking about she got facts correct, but came to a different conclusion. We're talking about somebody who literally got facts wrong. Another Wood who I have enormous amount of respect for, Gordon Wood, one of my absolute favorites, read him in graduate school. Gordon Wood, I mean, he goes through it as well. There are just so many historians that document where she gets it wrong. And if you criticize her, just like we're seeing now, if you criticize her, it is sexist or it's racist. And we're talking about somebody who is not getting facts correct. And she will be teaching in the journalism school where we should expect facts should be correct. Now, if you want to be an opinion person and come up with a different opinion, that's fine. But she is not even open to being to when her facts are challenged, to correcting those mistakes. It is problematic. It is especially problematic for journalism when it is at such a low point in American opinion anyway. Now we're putting somebody who doesn't get her facts straight, and she is going to be teaching the Husband School of Journalism. And now the whole thing, is about whether or not she got tenure. I love that Peter brought up the fact we should be looking at whether or not she even has the qualifications to teach at that level. When facts are wrong, and if she were teaching historical fiction, that might be something else. But we're talking about somebody who's teaching journalism and facts. She has proven, and she's been challenged, that the facts that she provides are not always accurate.
It's such an interesting point, Amy, and Jenna and others. I'd love for you to weigh in on this. What about the reputation of the journalism school itself? Kind of to Amy's point there about if your job is to teach the next generation of journalists, wouldn't you want to be incredibly careful about the rigor and the standards of journalism practiced by the people you hire? And that seems to be a real question here based on the consistent criticism by historians of the facts that she has gotten wrong in the project upon which she has received so many accolades.
I think that we cannot overestimate the thickness of the university bubble. I think the people who are at the Husband School and at Carolina were genuinely blindsided that the trustees would not think that Nikole Hannah-Jones was the best acquisition they could possibly get for the school. They are taken in by the accolades and the awards that she has won by her celebrity status. And I think that because they do live in, again, a university bubble and a very a political monoculture, they haven't heard or taken seriously the criticisms of Hannah-Jones. And so I don't think that they think that this celebrity on their staff is going to improve the reputation of the journalism school. And I think that you're right, they should be concerned about the academic quality of their school, but they've shown in the past that they're not. My colleague Jay Shallon wrote about it several years ago, that the journalism completely gutted its requirements for students in the major. They aren't required to take history or economics or statistics or any of the things that would help them become better journalists and better understand the things that they're reporting on. And so I think this is in keeping with the direction of the Hussman School in recent years, and it's a real shame.
Yeah, I think Peter's description of her as a academic celebrity is apt, but she's an academic celebrity seemingly without the academics. This has been going on for some time, and Peter and I, we all kind of point to the declines of the curriculum and standards. This is just a high-profile case of that, but that's precisely what is problematic in this case. I mean, the granting of tenure, the making someone a professor, putting them in a classroom, is not a matter of celebrity. It might be in some cases to bring somebody that has what we call tested experience. Someone actually is a journalist and has done the journalistic art. But you still have questions about their relationship with things called facts, or at least their way of approaching their work. This seems to have nothing to do with that. Indeed, I would go so far to suggest we seem to be having two conversations. As I read this story, and as I followed, obviously, more broadly, the 1619 debate and its association with other things like 1776, the claim here being made by the advocates of 1619 have nothing to do with facts. They don't claim to be following facts. Facts is not what this is about. They dispense with facts. This is a narrative. This is an ideology. This is about using, in this case, the academy, using a post, using a situation to advance a political argument. I think that that School of Journalism, the Board of Trustees, others who are watching all this going on, need to step back and realize what is happening. This is not merely one set of facts versus another set of facts that we disagree. This is upending the whole status of facts and history and truth for political purposes, to bring about an outcome which has nothing to do with those facts per se. That's not what this conversation is about. So I think that we shouldn't fool ourselves that, well, she has her critics because people on the right don't like her facts. No, that's not what this is about. This is a fundamental questioning of the whole academic project, the whole journalistic project itself, pursuing facts and writing about the truth. It undermines history. It questions history itself, and we should see that for what it is. It seems to me.
And to that point, Matthew, it's interesting. We have a comment on Facebook, and I've actually received a question about this by email. The 1619 project itself, could you give us an example, just perhaps just a brief summary of what it is that Nikole Hannah-Jones is arguing for, what she sees as a fact in her 1619 project, and what is wrong with that?
Well, I'll say generally, and I actually want to defer to Peter. He's actually written a lot about this and is very good on all this. And I think this echoes his original comment. It's the whole thing is based on a series of facts and claims and a narrative that gets the overarching interpretation of history wrong. It says that America was founded and began because of and for the sake of, in order to defend slavery. That's the essence and central idea that animates all of American history. That's both factually incorrect, but also just overarchingly historically incorrect. But my point is, it's intended to get around the actual facts of history in order to spin this other argument, to go after the very claims of things like the American founding and American history, for reasons that have to do with establishing that right now, in fighting current politics, this country is systemically racist, and therefore we need to have certain policy outcomes. that strikes me as the overarching factual problem, and I use facts, I guess, in orphan quotes here, of the whole 1619 project. Peter, would that be fair to say? But I mean, I know you would have more to say than that.
Well, that's entirely on point. This is a project that advances the thesis that America was racist from the get-go, that in August of 1619, slave ships, one slave ship and another one a month later, came to Jamestown, disgorged passengers who were captives. They had been captured in the Caribbean and brought north by what were actually pirate ships. Nikole Hannah-Jones says that's the beginning of slavery in America. Now, that's a very murky point because Jamestown didn't recognize slavery. They assimilated these people to the category of indentured servant. Within a few years, most of them were set free. They intermarried with the white population. They became full landowners and citizens of this country. So the very basic idea of 1619 as the beginning of slavery in America, that itself is false. But it's that seed is then grown up into this giant bush of claims that every significant event in subsequent American history was part of this scheme by which Black people were oppressed, denied their rights, and treated as chattels. That there is, of course, a history to American slavery that needs to be told, but she manages to get even the most basic part of it wrong. Now, some of the claims are so outrageous that they got even people on the far left exercise. The claim, for example, that the American Revolution, this is Nikole Hannah-Jones in her lead essay in the 1619 Project, saying that the American Revolution was fought by the colonists against the British in order to preserve the institution of slavery against the threat that the British Crown might abolish slavery and take our slaves away.
And Peter, on that point, correct me if I'm wrong, but even they, the New York Times, realized that had gone too far, and they kind of recanted in another printings or something, right?
Right. When the New York Times original fact checker, Professor Harris from Indiana University, came forward 6 months later and said, I told them that was wrong, but they didn't change it. Well, after she came forward, and she happens to be Black, they then went back to the original text and added 2 words. Instead of saying the colonists engaged in this rebellion to preserve slavery, they added some of the colonists did. Even that is false because none of the colonists did. The British never made that threat. We know from newspapers of the time, we know from the Declaration of Independence, we have the private journals and correspondence of numerous Americans living at the time of the Revolution. To our knowledge, to this day, no one has ever found an American colonist who said, yes, let's rebel against the British because they'll take our slaves away. In fact, the British were the biggest slave trading nation in the world at that point. The only complaint that Americans had about the British and the slave trade was that they were bringing too many slaves to the New World. This couldn't have been more false. It's utterly false, entirely false. I don't know what other adjectives I could put in there.
Yeah, but to just underscore, I mean, what strikes me, let's put it this way. If I wrote something very publicly and was criticized by Gordon Wood and James McPherson and Sean Wilentz and others, I would immediately pursue a discussion to discover the truth and the facts and have that conversation. The very fact that we're not doing that is this is either all or nothing. Either we must accept this 1619 project, or we are defenders of slavery. We want to erase history, and we're mean people. That just tells you right there. This is not about history. This is not about pursuing and trying to discover the accurate history and have a conversation with our students about that. This is about a political battle right now. And I think that just gives up the whole, that it's so obvious. And now this discussion about tenure for the key author of that I think just makes it all the more clear what's going on.
Now, we also have questions from our viewers wanting to know, what is the relationship between the 1619 Project and critical race theory? And here in North Carolina, we're having a big discussion about that being taught in our public schools. So what is the relationship? Are those two things the same, or how are they related?
I would give a simple answer to that, the 1619 Project is a concrete application of critical race theory. Critical race theory has been around in academia for several decades. Nikole Hannah-Jones knows what it is. She's simply taken its generalizations and tried to give them material form by this particularly egregious and false historical narrative. But they dovetail together. You could teach critical race theory without the 1619 Project, but the 1619 Project gives it life and form and makes it easier to slip into classrooms, which is the whole point.
Now, we are also, Amy, please go ahead.
I just want to add one thing to this, to a little bit to Matthew's point about the 1619 Project and being in this sort of political battle. Let's not forget too that 1619 is makes the New York Times relevant. Not that they weren't, but they hadn't had as big of a viewership as they did. Well, actually, I should take that back. So when 1619 was released, they said there were people lined up at newsstands like around city blocks. People were buying the New York Times print edition in droves. They hadn't seen that kind of response since Barack Obama was, since he won the election in 2008. So make no mistake, this is also a way for New York Times to make some money and be relevant in so many places across the country. I'm not saying that's the primary driver, but it is important to all of this.
I think
we're also hearing some talk and seeing some reporting that Nikole Hannah-Jones might consider a lawsuit over this. Is there any basis for that? I mean, what would she sue for? What would be the damages? That you received a contract for 5 years to teach at the UNC-Chapel Hill Journalism School.
I can't think of any credible legal argument that she could make, nor have I heard the planned legal argument that she's going to make. I've heard that she might sue, but I don't know what the charges would be, and I can't figure it out. I'm just not creative in that kind of way.
Well, if the facts don't matter, why not? Look, I think on this question of critical race theory, I think it's very important to understand, especially for the general reader and observer to understand, the person who's sending their kids to schools and hearing all these terms. For one thing, let's set aside what terms are used: critical race theory, identity politics, equity outcome of objectives. The terms keep changing. But it strikes me that the bottom line here is that there was a turn in history, and there's a longer explanation of that based on the kind of intellectual traditions of modern progressivism and liberalism. There was a turn in history that started looking at history intentionally backwards. The objective of history was not to find facts and to try to figure out what history was telling us, but it was to look backwards in history to find what we were looking for current objectives. That's actually what critical race theory is, or critical theory, which is we go back to find these things for the sole purpose of fighting current battles. Well, the current battle that they want to fight is about race. And critical race theory is to, applied to history, which is what 1619 Project does, is to look backwards, find what you're looking for, regardless of the facts, and make a narrative to fight that battle. So there's a connection here between all of these things and the study of history, which is very important. But again, we should look at it for what it is. This is not merely a dispute over the facts of history that's gotten wrapped up in the current public debate and discussion over the status of race in American politics. These are intimately, by definition, connected. And it was an intentional move in the current status of kind of the liberal scholarship to fight in this way in order to advance their political objectives, which is at the heart of what critical race theory was intended to do, which was to stir up race debates as a way to advance a hard left political agenda in the initial cases of critical theory and the thinkers behind critical theory to advance a Marxist political agenda. So it's all wrapped up into that. And we just see it for what it is.
Matthew, one of the things that you have done in your professional life is to serve as the executive director of President Trump's 1776 Advisory Commission. Can you give us kind of a brief summary of that commission's work, what it found, and where it stands?
Sure, and I'll kind of be pretty brief here. I want to hear other people and how this might connect. I took leave from Hillsdale College to be the executive director in December of last year. So this was actually after the election. The commission had been announced on last year's Constitution Day, and it was at the very end of the administration. What the heck do we do with this commission? Well, I mean, look, if the current president asked me to be involved in a commission on 1776, I would do that too. I took leave to put this commission together. The purpose of the commission, writ large, was to prepare the nation, to advise the president about getting ready for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which is coming up and is an important occasion. And so the first thing it asked for was a report about the status of the principles of 1776 in light of that and what those mean. So we took it as an opportunity. We had 20 commissioners and went about it in quick work to try to make a case, to put a marker down. We didn't invent new ideas. We didn't come up with any crazy new things. We made what would, I don't know, just a brief matter of time ago would have been considered a very mainstream argument that 1776 was actually the birthday of the country. It was the time at which these people who had been developing on the Eastern Seaboard and who had becoming a people and were governing themselves and had fled Europe for their liberty came together to declare their independence for a certain particular set of reasons that eventually led to the writing of a constitution. So that's just factually, crucially important. And so we write this report about what those principles mean, especially that we are the core principle that all men are created equal, and our guide through that look at the founding, if you will, to use kind of the way Dante would have a guide. Our guide was Abraham Lincoln, who pointed out, and I think this was, kind of gets back to our key about how to look at history. What drives history are not its imperfections and flaws. In the case of slavery, this dehumanizing barbaric institution. The report very clearly talks about it in those terms. But what drives the history of America is that it begins with this statement of a principle that was held to be self-evident and true. And so what's wonderful about American history is not its the compromises for slavery which were done in order to create the Union. What is great about America is that a nation which included slaveholders could begin the nation by saying that all men are created equal, and that the playing out of those principles ultimately led to abolition. The abolitionist movement began in America and grew out of the Declaration of Independence. That's the heart of the story we wanted to tell. And, oh, by the way, as we also used this is the argument of Martin Luther King, and we released a report on Martin Luther King Day on January 18th, 2 days before a new president was inaugurated and abolished the commission and took the report down from the website. And
that's an important point, and I don't want that to just slip by. Are you saying the Biden administration killed the commission and pulled the website?
They took the report down. One of the reasons why we wanted to get out on the 18th is that once it was published, it was a public document. So it could be taken down, but it's still out there floating around. And I encourage everybody to read it on their own, see what they think. But I just to come back to our discussion about critical race theory and these other things, there's an appendix in the report on that. The commission just recently submitted a letter to the Department of Education, giving them that appendix as a presidential advisory report to object to their regulation to teach that in the schools. But more importantly, I would point out that the executive order by which the 1776 Commission was abolished was the same executive order by which the new administration instructed the federal government to pursue not equality, but equity outcomes throughout the federal government. That is to say that the administration, given where it wanted to go intellectually, think identity politics and critical race theory, had to get rid of the 1776 Commission. They couldn't abide its continuation or existence because it denied the very premise for the political battle and the policy direction they wanted to go in.
Well, it seems we are at just such a critical and frankly astonishing point in our culture and our public discussion. And that is, on the one hand, what we're talking about today, which is the big controversy, Nikole Hannah-Jones, and hired by UNC-Chapel Hill, based in a project, 1619, that is completely different, Matthew, from what you're describing about American history that is chronicled in the 1776 Commission report. Two, what seems to be diametrically opposed sets of information about our founding. So what is a person supposed to do and believe is accurate?
Well, I've often asked whether the 1776 Commission was intentionally done to respond to the 1619 project, to which my answer was it wasn't. It makes note of it in one footnote, but otherwise that was not the intention at all. What it was to make an argument for the principles behind the driving principles of American history, and to point us towards developing an understanding of American history for teaching civics, but also preparing for the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, that is fair and accurate and honest and teaches it warts and all, so that despite all its flaws, we can see the principles behind it. And as I pointed out earlier, it's very important that we don't look at it as this is 1619 versus 1776. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is an accurate and fair history, and it's pretty impossible to deny that 1776 was somehow a historical speed bump of little importance in American history in favor of something else. The question seems before us is how to capture a good and accurate history and teach that to our students. And the ideological political debates put on the table by 1619, and remember, these debates over the status of the American founding were not invented yesterday. This has been going on for some time. I've been studying this. Peter and I have been putting parts of our lifetime into this work. This is an ongoing discussion inherent in American, what it means to be American. That's important in and of itself. And our intention here was to help us as a country, help states who are writing curriculum or instructing their states about curriculum, helping school boards who think about this, helping homeschooling moms, helping whoever we could by pointing them towards good and accurate history. We don't have the answer. We didn't claim to have an answer or make anything new up. We're just pointing towards good history, which heretofore, this is the history of Martin Luther King. This is the history of Abraham Lincoln. This is the history of the founding. This is the history of the civil rights movement. This is the history of the abolition movement. That's what we need to be teaching. And I think 1619 in the current debate is an ideological debate that we need to get beyond and get past quickly, so that we can get back to actually having good scholars teach good things in classrooms.
Amy, that's such an important point I think that Matthew has made. 1619, if you even just put that aside, put aside the UNC-Chapel Hill debate over Hannah-Jones's hiring, teaching history, and Amy, you have a degree in history, is so important, and we are hearing about it from parents here at the John Locke Foundation who are concerned about things that they are now finding their children are being taught in public school. Many parents had to become up close and personal with their child's education through necessity because of the pandemic, and suddenly they're concerned about some of the lessons that they are understanding their children are being taught. And that's why the Locke Foundation, particularly our Center for Effective Education with Dr. Terry Stoops and Dr. Bob Libke, they are focused on this. We're in the middle of a debate over social studies standards right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things on that, to Donna, to your point. One is that we got all kinds of questions from parents during pandemic and everything else. We're looking for a good history resource. Well, so John Locke Foundation has the North Carolina History Project. It is simply, the history of North Carolina, not trying to recreate American history. A lot of people are doing that, or trying to come up with an American history curriculum. We are actually taking our North Carolina History Project and turning it into a K-12 curriculum. So we're in the process of converting that. And to your point, school boards, school districts have actually come to us and said, when are you going to have it done? We need this. So there's a thirst for it. The other thing is, on this whole point of just like truth and honesty in history, our Dr. Terry Stoops just posted something on our website as North Carolina goes through these new social studies standards that they're putting out, and parents are wondering, is it critical race theory? And it is upending what we have thought of as traditionally American history, much of the stuff that Matthew has talked about. Our Dr. Terry Stoops they come out with some supporting documents, and they're just glossaries of terms, right? And remember, the State Board of Education, and these are people talking about social studies standards, history standards, that kind of thing. They come out with this supporting document, and it's a glossary of terms. And our center for head of the Center for Effective Education, Dr. Terry Stoops, starts looking at these terms and going, wait, where have I seen this stuff before? And goes and literally takes the verbiage from the State Board of Education and finds out that their sources are, Wikipedia. And then some of it's just flat out plagiarized. This is the State Board of Education. We have every right now as parents, if you should be concerned about what is being taught and ask questions. And that's where things like, first of all, that's why we need the 1776 Commission. That's why here at the John Locke Foundation, we're also coming up with this North Carolina history curriculum that follows our history project, so that people can get, will have other sources. But what Terry found was on what he found on those terms where they were using Wikipedia or flat out plagiarizing. Really, if you're going to plagiarize, are you going to plagiarize Wikipedia? I mean, come on. But with that, it disrupted an entire meeting and has sort of slowed that train down, because people are now starting to ask, wait a second, if they're not getting their definitions right, and they're getting their definitions from Wikipedia, and they're possibly plagiarizing, we've got our State Board of Education and its social studies standards have some serious issues. This is a theme right now in North Carolina, UNC with Nikole Hannah-Jones 1619 project and what she'll be doing, and certainly what is happening at the State Board of Education level.
Jenna, I think about this, and to me it's all so connected, because we see, as Amy describes here, what's happening with the State Board of Education moving through these social studies standards. Well, those kids then, some of them will end up in the state's university system. They will be, some of them, attending UNC-Chapel Hill and potentially being taught by someone whose claim to fame her signature project is the 1619 project. And so over the years, Jenna, it seems that there will become an acceptance of an alternative view of our country's founding, which could literally shape a generation or more. That seems to be pretty concerning, that we'd want to make sure that what kids are being taught are facts. Whatever they want to think about it is a whole nother issue. We all can come to our own conclusions about what we think is, quote, good or bad about our country, but we need to know actually what factually is good and bad about our country.
No, I think that is very troubling, but it's also nothing new. Schools, K-12 schools and colleges have been using Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States for years. And that book intentionally looks through the lens of the oppressed. And so at every turn, it points out the flaws in our country. And of course there are flaws, but it does not show, the purpose, the principles, the traditions that built our country, on the other side. And so that, of course, is nothing new. And the other thing I want to point out is that in some ways, it's, yes, the K-12 schools are feeding students who have been indoctrinated or will be indoctrinated into our universities, but it starts in our schools of education, in our universities, where teachers are being trained in some of the most politicized and anti-factual departments in universities. They are politically one-sided. They repeatedly ignore research to the contrary of their political agendas. Schools of education are the reason that for years students were taught whole language instead of phonics. And now schools of education are where teachers are learning about equitable math and ways to do, culturally sensitive science instead of learning facts. And so I'm going to put a lot of this, at the feet of our schools of education and our universities is where a lot of it got cooked up in the first place.
Well, this discussion has just been so valuable. I think we've helped to kind of end some of the falsehoods that we know are out there about, in particular, the Nikole Hannah-Jones hiring situation, and also had a good discussion about what is the premise of the 1619 project and the status of the 1776 commission. I'd like to make sure that we leave our viewers with resources. And so we know that, first of all, for reporting on this issue, you want to make sure that you come to carolinajournal.com at least once a day to be checking up on the reporting as this story continues to go along. We don't know exactly where it is going to go, but Carolina Journal will be covering that. Amy also mentioned the North Carolina History Project. You can go to that website for some really fascinating history that's North Carolina specific. If you were looking for just general knowledge or for your kids as supplements to what they are learning. Peter, you have written extensively about this issue. Where can folks find your writing about 1619 and Nikole Hannah-Jones?
I have a book titled 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project that's widely available. I've written on American greatness and the NAS's website, which is nas.org.
nas.org. Okay, terrific. And Matthew, where can folks find the 1776 Commission report, even though it's been pulled down from that website? If we just Google it, for example, can we find it?
So this is the beauty of it. It's a public document, which means it's in the public realm. So just search 1776 report text, it'll come up. Hillsdale's got it on our website. A bunch of other places have it on their website. So it's easily downloadable and it's public and free. I will note, by the way, that Encounter Books has put out a book version which includes all of the footnotes to all of our work, which they criticized an academic as myself for not having footnotes. And lo and behold, we've got a lot of footnotes to all that, to very mainstream historians. And the thing I point out is keep your eyes out. Hillsdale College will very soon publish a full history and civics curriculum available to the general public.
Awesome. Okay. And that website for Hillsdale is?
Hillsdale.edu.
Okay, there we go. We've been talking with Matthew Spalding. He is Vice President for Washington Operations with Hillsdale College. Peter Wood is the President of the National Association of Scholars. Jenna Robinson is President of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. And Amy Cook is the CEO, my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation. Folks, thank you so much. Really appreciate your perspective today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Donna.
And we also want to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being engaged, for caring about this debate, for wanting to know what is really going on, for caring about facts. That is so important. Every day, of course, we hope that you go to the website of the John Locke Foundation, which is johnlocke.org. All sorts of great fact-based, research-based information there on a variety of public policy issues. Also, journalism. Done the old-fashioned way, rigorous, based in facts. CarolinaJournal.com, that's the place to go for that. And lastly, today I would ask you to think about this. If you like what you are seeing here at Shaftesbury Society, if you want facts, if you want to know what's going on in the legislature, we would ask you to consider supporting the work that we do here at the John Locke Foundation with a financial contribution. It is tax deductible. We are a nonprofit organization. If you would like to do that, it's really simple and fast. Go to johnlocke.org. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a donate tab. Just click on that. It takes you less than 2 minutes to do that, to make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our work to further freedom and facts here in North Carolina. Thank you for all of your support in helping us do this work. Have a great week, everybody. Hope you'll join us again next week back here for Shaftesbury Society. On behalf of the entire team, I'm Donna Martinez. Thanks. Have a great week.